On the 4th of March, 1979, in the gravel lot behind the Cordray Farmers Co-operative in Vachel County, Kansas, an auctioneer named Vern Shoup stood on the tailgate of a pickup and spent 4 minutes trying to sell a wagon scale to 200 people who would not look at it. He had moved everything else off the bill in 3 hours. The augers, the leg sections, the 2 grain trucks, the pallet forks, the office chairs, an adding machine, a coffee urn nobody needed that went to a woman in the second row for $2. It was cold and getting colder. The crowd had its hands in its pockets and its collars up, and the last lot of the day was the one printed at the bottom of the sale bill in the smallest type on the sheet. Lot 61, 1 platform wagon scale, 16 feet, cast iron and oak, as is, where is, buyer removes. Where it was the problem. The scale was not a thing sitting on the ground that a man could hook onto. It was set into the earth. 16 feet of oak deck bolted to a steel frame, and under that deck, down in a concrete pit as deep as a grave. A system of cast iron, levers as long as fence rails resting on hardened steel pivots. All of it running to a column at the north end with the beam box on top of it. 4 tons of iron, most of it below grade. The co-op had quit using it in 1972 when it put in an electronic scale on the other side of the driveway, and for 7 years the old one had sat under a shed roof full of pigeons with a sheet of plywood over the deck and volunteer elm coming up through the coping. Vern Shoup opened it at $100 because he had to open it somewhere. He got nothing. He asked for $75, then $50, and by then the crowd had begun to enjoy itself, because a sale is a long day and men will take their entertainment where they find it. Somebody in the back asked whether the pigeons went with it. Somebody else asked if a man could get a discount for the elm tree. Then Rex Hollenbeck said the sentence that finished the bidding. Hollenbeck was 51 years old, a dealer out of Hutchinson who came to every sale in 5 counties in the same mustard tan jacket, and he said it loud enough to carry to the office porch. $40 for 4 tons of iron you cannot lift, cannot move, and cannot sell. That got the biggest laugh of the day. It was also a fair description, and everyone there knew it. Whoever bought that scale was buying a jackhammer weekend, a crane bill, and a hole in the ground he had to feel in himself. Vern Shoup came down to $40 and set it flat. The way an auctioneer says a number, he has stopped believing in. Near the fuel barrels, an old man in blue denim bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of weak coffee lifted one finger about 6 inches off his belt buckle. His name was Emmett Krause. He was 66 years old. He farmed 600 acres of corn and milo south of town, and he had said nothing all afternoon. Shoup asked for $45 twice and got the silence he expected. Sold $40, and 180 people turned around to see who had done it, and when they saw who it was, they laughed again, but gentler, the way you laugh at an uncle. Emmett Krause walked up to the clerk's window, wrote a check for $40, and folded the receipt into his shirt pocket. Rex Hollenbeck caught him at the tailgate and asked him what in the world he wanted with it. Emmett said he wanted a scale. That is the whole of what he said, and for a long time afterward, people in Vachel County repeated it as a joke. Because a man who pays $40 for 4 tons of buried iron in order to have a scale is a man who has not thought it through. He had thought it through. He had been thinking about that scale since 1927. If you've made it this far into Emmett's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. His father, Otto Krause, hauled to Cordray from the year the scale went in, which was 1911, until he quit farming in 1953. When Emmett was 14, his father had stood him up on the oak deck with a load of hogs so the weighman could tell him what he weighed, and the weighman had leaned out the window and said 109 pounds and no charge for the boy. Emmett remembered the sound of the deck under his boots. He remembered his father saying the thing he said about that scale every time he pulled onto it, which was that iron does not drift. That was Otto Krause's line, and it was not sentiment. It was mechanics, and he was right about it. A beam scale does not measure weight, it compares weight. The load on the deck goes down through a chain of cast iron levers whose arms were laid out at a foundry to a fixed ratio, and at the end of that chain a small brass poise slides along a graduated beam until the beam floats level between two loops. Nothing in that system is electrical. Nothing in it is calibrated by a technician with a screwdriver. The ratio is where the holes were drilled, and holes drilled in cast iron in 1911 are in exactly the same place in 1979. There is no adjustment to slip and no component to age out of tolerance. If the pivots are sharp and the levers are free and the poise is the poise that came with it. A beam scale is either right or it is obviously broken. There is no quiet third condition. It took him 3 weekends to get it out. His son-in-law brought a tractor with a loader, and a neighbor named Lyle Bratcher brought a jackhammer and an air compressor and a bad attitude about the whole project. They pulled the plywood and the deck planks off first and looked down into the pit, and what they saw was 7 years of pigeon mess, a foot of chaff, a fallen cottonwood limb, and under all of it, the levers lying in the dark, exactly where the men from the scale works had set them 68 years before. Lyle Bratcher looked down into that pit and used the word every other man there used, which was scrap. Emmett got down in the pit with a flashlight and a putty knife and spent most of a Saturday cleaning the chaff off one pivot. What he found under it stopped him. The knife edges of a wagon scale, the hardened steel wedges the levers rock on, are the whole instrument, and the way you ruin a scale forever is to let those edges rust and round over. The men who shut this one down in 1972 had not simply walked away from it. Somebody had packed every pivot on that scale in yellow cup grease, thumbed it in around each bearing like a man icing a cake, and laid a strip of tar paper over each one. The grease had gone hard and dark. Under it the steel was bright. Somebody had put that scale to bed properly, meaning to come back. The second thing he found was on the beam. The beam box on top of the column had a little cast door, and inside it decades of farmers had scratched initials in the paint while they waited for the weighman, and one of them, low on the left, was O. Krause, 1931, cut with a nail in letters 1/2 inch high. Hanging off the end of the beam itself on a twisted copper wire was a soft gray button of lead about the size of a thumbnail, crimped over the wire and stamped with the seal of the state of Kansas and the numerals 1968. That was the part nobody at the sale had looked at, and it was worth more than the iron. A commercial scale in Kansas is not legal for trade because it is accurate. It is legal for trade because a state inspector has tested it and sealed it. And the lead seal is the physical proof that no one has opened the beam since he did. The seal on this beam was intact. It had not been broken, cut, or replaced. That meant the last thing the state of Kansas ever did to this scale was certify it in 1968, and that the co-op had not condemned it in 1972 at all. It had simply bought something newer. They hauled it out over the last 2 weekends of March on a lowboy trailer, in pieces the way it went in, and Emmett Krause spent the spring rebuilding it in his own yard 40 feet from the corn crib. He dug the pit himself with a backhoe he rented by the day, and he did the rest of it slower than anybody around him thought reasonable. He salvaged the original limestone pier blocks out of the Cordray pit and hauled those home too, because the pier blocks were what the levers had learned to sit on. He set them in fresh concrete. He shimmed the lever stands with brass shim stock 1/1000th of an inch at a time, checking with a machinist's level he borrowed from the high school shop teacher, until the main lever swung the full arc of its travel and came back and settled without a sound. He replaced 11 feet of rotten oak decking with white oak he had sawn from his own windbreak. He cleaned the poise with kerosene and a toothbrush and did not touch its weight with anything, because the poise is the standard, and a man who files a poise has ruined the scale as surely as if he had shot it. It took him until the end of July. His wife Dorothy asked him exactly one question about it in 5 months, which was whether he intended to charge people, and he said he had not thought about it. On the 9th of August, 1979, a man named Wendell Voth drove out from the state's Weights and Measures Division in a green truck with a hydraulic tailgate and 800 pounds of certified cast iron test weights on it. Voth was 58, dry as a cracker, and had spent 30 years being lied to by men with scales, and he made no secret on arrival of what he thought about testing a 1911 Wagon scale in a farmyard. He tested it 4 ways. He ran the weights out to each corner of the deck to check for a lean. He built the load up in increments. He put the whole 800 pounds on and took it off 5 times to see whether the beam came back to the same place, which is the test that catches a sticky pivot. Then he tested the beam itself against his own certified poise. The scale was correct at every point he tested, and its worst error at the far corner of the deck was 6 pounds. Wendell Voth stood there with his clipboard for a while and then said that in 30 years he had condemned better scales than most men had ever stood on, and he had not expected to certify one that a man bought for $40. He crimped a new lead seal onto the beam wire, wrote out the certificate, and told Emmett Krause the thing that was, in the end, the whole hinge of this story. He said a beam scale is the only kind he never argues with because iron does not drift. Emmett said he had heard that before. Now here is where it turns, and it turns on a load of corn. On the 20th of September, 1979, Emmett Krause put 712 bushels of corn on his tandem truck, pulled it onto his own scale in the yard, and weighed it. He wrote the gross on the back of an envelope. Then he drove the 9 miles to Cordray and pulled onto the co-op's electronic scale, and Ruth Nagel in the window printed his ticket, and the number on the ticket was 540 pounds lighter than the number on his envelope. 540 pounds of corn is about 9.5 bushels. At the price that morning, it was a little over $22. Emmett Krause did not say a word to anybody at the co-op. He drove home, and for the next 4 days he assumed he was the one who was wrong, because that is what a reasonable man assumes when his $40 scale disagrees with a certified commercial scale. He got Wendell Voth back out. Voth ran the whole test again with his certified weights in the same 4 ways, and the farm scale was still correct within 6 pounds. That is the moment the story changes shape. Emmett Krause had not gone looking for anything. He had bought his father's scale because it was his father's scale, and because he wanted to weigh his own cattle at home without hauling them to town. He had built it to be right so that he could trust his own numbers. And now the only conclusion the arithmetic allowed was one he did not want, which was that for at least one load on one day, the scale that every farmer in Vachel County was paid by had been wrong in the co-op's favor. One load proves nothing. He knew that. So he did what a careful man does, and he said nothing to anyone for 6 weeks. He weighed every load he hauled at fall at home first, wrote the gross on an envelope, and kept the co-op ticket stapled to it. Then he began asking neighbors quietly, one at a time, whether they would mind pulling on to his scale on the way in. He did not tell them why. He told them he was checking his own work, which was true enough. Lyle Bratcher, who had called the thing scrap in a concrete pit in March, hauled 11 loads across it in October and never once asked what it was for. On the 9th load, he sat in his truck in the co-op driveway with a ticket in his hand and did not start the engine for a while, and then he drove back out to Emmett's place instead of going home and stood in the shop door and asked to see the envelopes. He was the first person in Vachel County besides Emmett Krause to know, and his first reaction was not anger either. He said the number out loud twice, and then he said that he had been telling his wife for 2 years that he was farming worse than his father had. By the last day of October, there were 31 pairs of numbers on the kitchen table from 9 different farms and 6 different trucks. The pattern in them was not random, and that is what made it damning. On every empty truck, the 2 scales agreed within 30 pounds. On light loads, they agreed, but every loaded truck weighed light in town, always light, never heavy, and the shortage grew with the load. At 30,000 pounds gross, the gap was around 150 pounds. At 40,000, it was near 400. At the heaviest loads, the tandems that came in at 50,000 pounds gross, it ran past 600. An error that grows with the load is not a broken scale. A broken scale is wrong all the time and somebody notices in a week. This was something worse, because it was invisible in exactly the places anyone would look. And it explained something the county had been arguing about for 3 years without knowing it. Men had been grumbling since 1976 that Cordray weighed light, and every one of them had been told it was moisture, or dockage, or the way he heaped his truck, and every one of them had half believed it, because who argues with a certified scale? Ruth Nagel had a sentence she used at the window when a man complained, and she used it kindly, and she believed it completely. The scale is the scale. Emmett Krause took his envelopes to the co-op board on the 6th of November, 1979, and it went the way you would expect. Harley Dunn, who had been board president for 9 years, pointed at the state certificate hanging framed by the office door and asked Emmett whether he understood that the scale was inspected every single year and had passed every single time. 2 members would not look at the envelopes at all. Somebody said out loud that a man who paid $40 for a pile of junk was now telling the co-op its equipment was junk, and there was some laughter in the room, though less than there had been in March. It was the manager, Gene Pfeiffer, who broke it. Pfeiffer was 47 and had been at Cordray 11 years. And he had been the one telling farmers about moisture since 1976. He picked up the stack of envelopes and read 6 of them, and then he put them down and said the only sentence that could have gotten anybody anywhere. He said, "Run it again," with the state standing there, and if we are right, we are right. So they set it for Saturday, the 10th of November, 1979. And Wendell Voth brought the state's test truck. What happened that morning in the co-op driveway is the reason people in Vachel County still know Emmett Krause's name. Voth did not test the electronic scale the way he tested it every year. Every year, he tested it with 10,000 pounds of certified weights, because that is what the annual test called for and what fits on a test truck. This time, he built the load all the way up, in stages, using the state's weights and then adding sealed drums of water on a second truck, and he weighed each stage on the co-op scale and then drove it 9 miles out to Emmett Krause's yard and weighed it on the wagon scale and back again. At 10,000 pounds, the two scales agreed within 20 pounds. That is the number that mattered most, and almost nobody watching understood it yet. At 20,000, they agreed within 40. At 30,000, the co-op scale read 160 pounds light. At 40,000, it read 390 pounds light. At 50,000 pounds gross, with about 60 people standing along the driveway fence in their coats and Rex Hollenbeck among them in the mustard tan jacket. The co-op certified electronic scale read 610 pounds lighter than the beam scale a man had bought at their own sale for $40. Wendell Voth read the number twice, once off the head and once off his own sheet, and then he said it out loud to the fence line, and nobody laughed. That was the sound of it. 60 men in November, and not one laugh. And Emmett Krause standing at the end of the deck with his hands in his overall pockets, saying nothing at all, the same as he had said at the sale. The cause took them 90 minutes to find, and it was not electronic and not mysterious. Voth had the co-op's loader lift the north end of the deck out of the pit. On the concrete, coping under it where nothing should ever touch, there was a streak of bare bright concrete about 14 inches long, polished smooth, with the paint and scale rubbed clean off the steel frame directly above it. The deck had been riding on the pit wall. Not always. Only when it was loaded heavily enough to deflect, and then the heavier the load, the harder it bore, and every pound that went into that concrete was a pound that never reached the load cells. The check rod that held the deck centered in the pit was measured and found to be half an inch short. In March of 1976, a field truck had backed into the north end of that deck hard enough to bend the rod, and a shop in town had straightened it, cut it, and welded it back up, and nobody had ever put a gauge on it afterward, because it is a rod, and rods do not seem like instruments. It had been stealing from every heavy load in Vachel County for 3 years and 8 months, and it had passed a state inspection every one of those years, because the annual test used 10,000 pounds, and the fault did not wake up until 30,000. Wendell Voth red-tagged the scale that afternoon, and it did not weigh another bushel until it was rebuilt in the spring. What came after was slow and unglamorous, and mostly done by accountants. The co-op had kept its scale tickets, as elevators do, and the state had the error curve from the November test, and between the two of them they could put a number on what every loaded truck since March of 1976 had actually been carrying. The board voted the corrections in January of 1980 rather than fight them. The total came to $79,000, paid out across 214 farms, and the average check was about $370, and one family in the north of the county got a little over $900. Nobody went to jail, because nobody had done anything but weld a rod short and trust a certificate. That is the part of this story people leave out when they tell it, and Emmett Krause never left it out. He said more than once that the co-op had not cheated anybody. He said a piece of iron had bent, and everybody in the county had agreed for 3 years and 8 months to believe a number instead of checking it. The scale in his yard is the last thing to tell you about. He never charged anybody. Word got around that winter, and by the following harvest there were mornings when 3 trucks were lined up in Emmett Krause's driveway before 7 o'clock, waiting to weigh it home before they hauled to town, and he came out in his coat with the beam box door open and worked the poise himself because he did not like anybody else's hand on it. The co-op's new scale, rebuilt and resealed, was correct after 1980. It did not matter. Men kept coming anyway, and they were not really checking the elevator. They were doing what Otto Krause had done in 1911, which was to look at a number with their own eyes before they let somebody else write it down. He weighed at that scale for 11 more years and died in 1991, and the last certificate the state ever issued on it hung in the beam box next to a nail scratch that read, "O. Krause, 1931. 200 people watched that scale come up for sale on a cold Saturday in March, and every one of them did the same arithmetic, which was 4 tons of iron in a hole minus a jackhammer weekend. Minus a crane bill equals scrap. The arithmetic was correct. What none of them counted was the one thing on it that had no scrap value at all, a gray button of lead the size of a thumbnail on a twisted copper wire stamped 1968, hanging there in plain sight where anybody could have walked over and read it. $40 for 4 tons of iron you cannot lift, cannot move, and cannot sell. That was the line, and it got the biggest laugh of the day, and it was wrong by $79,000.